Hello, Acid Horizon patrons. This is Craig here. This is our informal discussion of Proust and Signs with Taylor Adkins and Cooper of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. Also, Will joins us for this discussion too. This episode is about one of Deleuze's texts that I'm a little bit less familiar with. Taylor has read it. Cooper and Will are kind of coming at it for the first time too. In this episode, we are using some of the tools that we've gotten from other readings of Deleuze to interpret the text in focus. Now, if you're not a patron, you're going to get about the first 15 to 20 minutes of this episode. So if you want to hear the rest, for as little as $1, you can hop onto our Patreon account and get all of the exclusive content that we already have behind the scenes. For the most part, that includes an RSS feed of full episodes that we have already recorded earlier this year. So hop aboard if you're interested. We would love to have you there. Okay, let's go to the discussion. Episodes a little bit differently every time. Like sometimes I just blast it. Like here's the standard episode. Boom, there's the theme music. Here's what we're doing. And then boom, like I just try to mix it up just to keep it interesting. And whenever Taylor's been on, I'm just like, all right, we got Taylor in the studio and let's check in on the conversation.
That's kind of how me and Coop go. We just start talking and then eventually he'll hit the record button and I feel my spidey senses start tingling a little bit and I'm like, all right.
All this will probably get cut out, but you never know. You never know. Like one day I might feel adventurous and then the green room discussion is online. But you guys saw all those questions that I sent you, right?
Yeah, I can pull them up.
What have you read of Proust, Taylor?
What have I read of Proust? I had to read more Proust than I really wanted to because of the Machinic Unconscious.
Right.
So I've had, I had the 3 volumes in French, which are beautiful, tiny font volumes, but they're amazing. I had to have those along with, I was using the most recent Penguin translations. It has different translators, but the first volume is by Lydia Davis, who herself is a famous translator and fiction author. And that one I have read pretty much cover to cover. The other books I've kind of just jumped in and out of. So I can't say that I have not completed my search of lost time.
I think though that like we're going to be focusing primarily on the literary mechanisms present in Proust.
Yes.
Especially if we're going to be oscillating, I'd imagine, between Proust and Signs and the later essays in Machinic Unconscious, which is, going to be, I don't want to say idiosyncratic, because you know what I mean? Like literarily virtual.
Yeah, I don't mind any direction we go. Here's what I'm worried about, though. Given the density of this very small book, like just getting our head around what's inside this book is a challenge.
Well, that's why I think your questions are great, specifically because they function as that sort of. I had a philosophy professor in undergrad. He's like, I don't give a shit if you Google this text and read the Wikipedia page before you open it up. Like you need some sort of primer. He was talking about the selection of being and time. And one thing that this episode can serve as, and what a lot of your Concepts in Focus episodes do, and like the other Guattari episode with Taylor, was that they're great ways to initially get sort of your feet wet with the content present in these relatively difficult works. So I think if we don't stray too far from the questions.
Well, your first question, Craig, about whether we need to have read Proust to read Proust and Signs by Deleuze. I think it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I would say no, with the caveat that that becomes much more plausible if one is at least familiar with some of Deleuze's works. I mean, Will brought it up earlier about Div's repetition, obviously the image of thought chapter, for example, but there's other stuff too where you'll see, you brought up Body Without Organs at the end, in the middle of the book too. He's kind of flirting with this question of organic totality and Platonism and how Proust kind of subverts a lot of that. So you have these themes, and then there's other themes about becoming a woman, etc., that we see in A Thousand Plateaus. So if there is a mild familiarity with Deleuze, that definitely helps. Now, if one has never read Deleuze or Proust, I do feel like it's still an eminently readable book. I think that you're going to need a minimum, and this is with basically any text. You could say like Gadamer's, you got to have a kind of horizon of sort of understanding hermeneutic, like prejudging. But if you don't have any of that, I don't necessarily think. I would say this is like one of the best intros to Deleuze, but given those two caveats, given that there needs to be at least kind of a minimum.
I would say even for me, like having Deleuze is definitely fairly newish ground for me, and I felt like this was a good intro because you get a little bit of Bergson, you get a little bit of Nietzsche, you get a little bit of just like I said, kind of a general semiotic approach to the text. And it's very readable. It's not like it's very it's pretty clear on so much of the content.
It doesn't feel as difficult as
it
doesn't feel as difficult as like difference repetition. I mean, that
nowhere near as difficult. And I think that the narrative, even not having read the book at all, Proust, no exposure to Proust whatsoever, I was able to glean enough just through like Deleuze's commentary.
Yep.
To make it a valuable read. I enjoyed the hell of it. I mean, I thought it was like some of the most beautiful prose. Like it was almost poetic at times.
And also, I think what you see is the inversion of Platonism and the attack on Kantianism, but uses of Kant, right?
Yep.
And uses of Plato, reappropriation of terms and concepts from them. So maybe what we can do is actually maybe Taylor, as best as you can, maybe you could give us just like a brief synopsis, like what is Proust doing in that book in search of lost time? What is the sort of elevator pitch for that book?
This kind of goes back to Will's comment to try to summarize like the movement of the narrative would be very difficult, but I will summarize it instead of the way that maybe Deleuze does it. Guattari makes it very clear that his reading in the second part of Machinic Unconscious is focused on juxtaposing I would say there's two kind of, there's really not just two, but if we wanted to simplify as much as possible, there's two sort of main protagonists for In Search of Lost Time, even given the hundreds of characters. So, I mean, like you have Swann, and that's who we start with. And, Swann is sort of, he is this more or less, bourgeois man of culture and taste, and he is exposed to this, to these movements in art. He's kept abreast of all these movements, and he's kind of like an art critic, so to speak. And he's kind of the foil for the narrator who will be the true hero of the text. And so, if you can even call it that, insofar as Swann will sort of become madly in love and fall madly in love, but and this is what Guattari says, like he has everything there to become either a great thinker or critic or even a great artist himself, except that he gets kind of caught in this black hole around this passional kind of gravitational pull for this love, and it becomes this neurotic collapse, and he fails. And so he's kind of a foil for the narrator who seemingly is falling into the same traps. But for Guattari, it is this exposure to this kind of machinic proposition, so to speak, to put that in scare quotes, by this sort of minor fictional composer named Van Tuyl. And it's this little phrase from, that's what Proust will call it, this little musical phrase from Van Tuyl's works that at first kind of burrows a hole, if you will, kind of sometimes the way jingles do into the narrator's head, but then it kind of lays dormant but it ferments, and then it crystallizes, and it produces these unintended consequences that lead him to be able to thwart and ward off that same failure that we see Swann succumbing to, and thereby, through these great efforts and through 7 books later, finally he kind of he's able to access that realm of art and become the great artist that he had set out to be. That's just one of the movements, and that really doesn't summarize at all the book.
Right.
But for Guattari, he's going to focus on those two figures, the swan and the narrator, to describe two different aspects of schizoanalysis: the generative side, which is on sort of the weaker side, working with these less dynamic aspects, and then the transformational side, which we'll see with the narrator. And he, obviously his whole thing is about faciality and refrains, which is two huge components, which even Deleuze hits upon in Proust and Signs.
Does the little phrase have any relation to the refrain? Because that's kind of where my head was going.
Yeah, that Vantua's little phrase would be a refrain that isn't able to be reduced either to like its written musicographical, like scriptural component, or even the singular notes. Right, it is this kind of crystal of time that holds the semiotic, sort of asignifying, agrammatical, metabolic, catalyzing key to the narrator, and it really helps to sort of propel him out of the black hole. That the little phrase is it's a refrain. It's a like hyper it's a hyper catalyzing crystal of time that unlocks all. It has like these singularities that compose with the not the pun, with the narrator's artistic intentions in it, and it for Guattari, he thinks that's actually, for him, that's the hero of the novel instead of the protagonist or Swan.
Well, since we touched on the theme of time, maybe this is like where we'll say this is the beginning of the discussion of Proust and Signs, because the chief claim, or the chief phrase for me in the book, is that the search for truth is the search for lost time. I think there's a way in which we could argue for that being the central phrase of the text. And maybe we can all kind of speak on our sort of reading or interpretation of that. And I mean, Taylor, you're welcome to go first, or Cooper, if you'd like.
No, please. I've already talked enough.
Yeah. So Cooper, maybe for you, like, what did that phrase mean? And of course I'll get in there too, but like, what does that phrase mean, and why is it important in the book?
Man, I don't know. That's honestly something I struggled with, I think, to sort of understand what Deleuze was getting at as far as that goes. I don't even know if I could really even speak to that well, to be honest.
I can kind of give my take on it. One of the things that seems to be happening in the text here, first, is there's this notion of the apprenticeship, right? And so the apprenticeship is what? All of us, or at least the main character in Search for Lost Time, is somebody who embarks on this apprenticeship of signs. And what does that mean? It basically means that there is a world of emissions of signs that we are all inscribed within. First, what Deleuze calls the worldly domain, right? And then from there are escalating levels, I guess you would say, of a more enlightened understanding of signs, a more enlightened level of the apprenticeship. And that takes us all the way up through a sort of effective ladder from the mundane world to the world of love, and then jealousy and anger and angst and pain, and then the sensuous domain of signs, which is composed of both pain and joy. And then there's a level above that, which is this domain of pure joy or essence, right? And this is a model for philosophy for Deleuze, right? And one of the things we'll probably want to talk about is the image of thought. How has philosophy been construed in classical terms from the time of Plato and from the time of Socrates, right? And so one of the ways that we understand philosophy as it comes to us from the Greeks is that philosophy has questions like, what is ellipsis, right? What is being, question mark, being with a capital B? And this problematization of questions like what is being is done so at the exclusion of other kinds of questions. For example, like, How did this happen? When does being happen? How does being happen? Who does being happen to, right? And these other questions are positioned as more fundamental. And the enterprise of doing philosophy is one that's conducted voluntarily. We take on these questions as philosophers. We have an identity as philosophers, and we proceed from there. But what Deleuze does in this book is he gives a model for thought, a model of the creation of concepts that doesn't position voluntary thought, voluntary memory at the center. In fact, the impetus to think comes from the outside, as he says, right? And also the impetus to think doesn't come from the figure of the friend, right? Somebody who's valorized in classical philosophy. I'm thinking, Plato and Aristotle, right? In fact, the figure of the friend is one who's positioned as sort of adversarial in this search. I don't know if that's triggered anything in you, Taylor or Cooper, but I'd like to hear your sentiments on that so far.
Did you want me to jump in, Coop?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I love that's a great way to start, and it's interesting that Deleuze, you mentioned it earlier, there's a contention with Kant as well as a contention with Plato. And the book that he wrote, I think it was maybe a year and a half before Proust and Signs, was Kant's Critical Philosophy, where he beautifully kind of sets out a novel reading, in my opinion, of the three critiques, and thereby kind of shows that the way thought actually happens isn't with the harmony of the faculties, but in their disaccord and their disharmony. And that causes, and so whenever, depending on the critique, whichever faculty is sort of taking the lead or taking precedence, it is, as you said, informed from the outside, and then is taken to its limit and contributes or communicates a violence to the next faculty, and takes, etc. So there is this, but it's cool here that like he turns to Proust to really articulate this idea of goodwill is presupposed by, you said classical philosophy. I'll kind of use the term that Laura Well puts forth in a outside of his domain, but it's really this notion of standard philosophy and non-standard philosophy. And Proust is kind of pushing philosophy to its limit, taking it to its word, and saying that if we stick to this classical image of thought, or the standard image of thought, this philosophical image of thought, then we really only stay on the level of the conventional, is one aspect of it, or on the level of resemblance, analogy, etc. And it's precisely what needs to, and this is where I think too Simondon is already present in this text, even though he's not cited. I mean, this was published the same year that Simondon's the physical biological individuation book is published. It's 1964, and in that book, what Simondon makes clear is you can't start from fully constituted individuals from ontological terms and then think back to ontogenesis or to individuation, which is why Deleuze finds in Proust, in this move towards the highest level of science, towards essences, towards the work of art, which he finds that in that a principle of individuation. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he says that. I do think that there would have been, that he's thinking Simondon here as well, but he's using Proust and he's using literature and the work of art to explicate that. And it even says something that for a philosopher, I mean, and Deleuze does, I think, would agree that he is a philosopher. He takes from Proust that, let's see, it's on page 30 in the Apprenticeship chapter, a work of art is worth more than a philosophical work, for what is enveloped in the sign is more profound than all the explicit significations, right? So it's this level of classical image of thought where everything is explicit, everything is already explicated. And I think that that's presupposing what has to be shown, which is precisely that explication, complication, and we'll get another term from Deleuze in his thinking at the end of the difference of repetition, about perplication. That word isn't used here, but it's all of that is involved in, taking the faculties to their limit. And classical thought, the classical image of thought, doesn't as I said, kind of already presupposes that that the work of reflection is all one needs to do. One needs to just, either with an analytic frame, one needs to either just have a clear and distinct, uses of language to get rid of illusions or whatever. And I think that for Deleuze, as he sees in Proust, the clear and distinct is not where thought happens. That's not where thought is engendered. That's a mere kind of epiphenomenal, imagistic way of thinking of thought. It's a dead image of thought, if you will, too.
Right. And I think the terms need to be clarified somewhat. You really hit upon some important things. And the way that I'm approaching this book, I mean, I'm a teacher by trade. So imagine if I had to teach this book to somebody who didn't know Deleuze well. Like, what's the hook here? Like, what's in it for me? And I think the one thing that Deleuze offers to us first is he gives us a different picture of the philosophical life, like we're talking about. And you mentioned the term individuation, right? And you associate that term with Simondon. I actually associate that term with Carl Jung. But I think there's something of a program, an ethical program for individuation happening within this text, or at least being suggested in this text. Why is this book important to anyone? And I think of, for example, anyone who tries to determine whether or not a life lived as a philosopher, or, taking on philosophy as a hobby, or just deciding to read a philosophy book, or engaging in any discipline that involves concepts, which means art. It means things like sociology, even on Deleuze's term, anywhere where this notion of the concept is at work. And the thing that I find most important is in this text is that the philosophical life is basically undergirded by the non-philosophical dimension of our lives. And this is what he's saying here, is that this apprenticeship that takes him along from the world of worldly signs, through the signs of love, to the sensuous signs, and then to the signs of pure joy, is this sort of march that involves a recovery or regaining of lost time and wasted time. And I think for the philosopher, in our lives, that which has philosophical import may not be immediately recognizable to the philosopher until they get to the page, until they start working with concepts. And so there's one reading of this that I see as a very redemptive model of philosophy, in the sense that if you're just trying to make sense out of life, what is it around you that is going to allow you to do that? Well, there are signs, there are forces, there are emissions that come from the outside, in the form of violence. There's clearly a philosophical definition of violence here, but sometimes it could mean real violence. The instigation to think, to understand, for example, oppression comes from real material violence, for example, or to understand why it is we feel pain and sadness at the loss of love is also an instigation to think. So I think that's one of the things that, like, if we ever lose our place in terms of attempting to understand this book, I think that's an important, like, sort of touchstone to come back to.
Coop, did that have any violence upon your sensibilities?
I mean, I just think it kind of recalls a little bit of Baudrillard as far as the violence of the image and kind of the murder, like he calls it the murder of the real, but I don't know if that is necessarily the same road that Deleuze is going down.
Can you say more about the murder of the real?
Let's see. I'm trying to think. So I actually have this whole lecture it's kind of referenced in the opening track to my podcast. And he's just talking about the violence of the image, and what occurs at that point is the murder of the real. But I don't know. I don't know how to explicate that and match and line that up with what Deleuze is saying. But that's just kind of the image. I don't know if Deleuze is talking about the same violence that Baudrillard is necessarily, because I think for Baudrillard it's like the it's all related to simulation and the simulacra. And I don't know that that's necessarily where Deleuze is going here.
I think he would later with Logic of Sense, but
I mean, I don't know in this text. One thing I want to return to and just maybe drill into Craig for an answer about this is kind of what do we get? I still want to kind of be sold on this being one's entrance to Deleuze. In a sense,
I can help there.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I mean, because in a sense, I want to see, because I have my own arguments as to why I think Deleuze's solo work early in his career is really important to understanding his work with Guattari through Capitalism and Schizophrenia all the way to what is philosophy. But what are some direct conceptual relationships? Maybe we'll start with you, Cooper, that you saw between the Deleuze that you hear about, right? The Deleuze of Anti-Oedipus, and what we see operating here. What strands, what relationships can you draw? What theoretical strings did you place on the tack board?
So I think he even Deleuze even references Bergson specifically, but there's a quote here on page 58. For if the present was not past at the same time as present, if the same moment did not coexist with itself as present and past, it would never pass. A new present would never come to replace this one. The past, as it is in itself, coexists with and does not succeed. The present it has been. It is true that we do not apprehend something as past the very moment we experience it as present, except in some cases of paramnesia, of course, which may account for the vision in Proust of the three trees. So that's pretty blatantly Bergsonian, I think. And really exemplifies sort of that's in a paragraph, sort of just clarifies kind of what Bergson's whole perception, or his whole concept of time itself. And I think really that just kind of clarifies it a little bit.
Yeah. No, I think it does, and specifically as it relates to and I'm going to need some help from Craig here, because of the people on the podcast, he's when it's just our little gang, he's the one that has to basically handhold us through through Deleuze.
Same thing with
but in Difference in Repetition, about halfway through the Repetition for Itself chapter, we get this sort of assertion about the securing of time at the level of the subject. And he sort of says, how can we secure time for ourselves? How can we make it so that we're not always just pure subjects of time, right? Which is the way in which Deleuze is trying to correct some of the misinterpretations of Bergson, is that oftentimes because Bergson was very popular when he was writing among broadly the intelligentsia, not just the academy. In fact, in the academy, he probably had more enemies. But the common misinterpretation of Bergson is that, we all just have a subjective relationship to time. That's in fact where our free will is found. And while that is the subjectivity is important, it doesn't end there. For Deleuze, and he makes this clear in Difference in Repetition and in Cinema 2 specifically, Bergson also sort of argues that we are subject to time, that time actually is the only entity with subjectivity here. But there's this moment in Difference in Repetition that's really, really difficult to pin down, where Deleuze talks about securing time through reminiscence, and then briefly mentions Proust. And I saw sort of an ethical assertion there about our relationship to time. And Craig, when we were speaking, privately a couple hours ago, you were talking me through sort of this relationship and its roots in sort of the Platonist interpretations of the subject. And I was wondering, if you could explicate that here.
Okay, well, I'll do my best. I mean, the irony here is that I'm also regaining lost time by having not read this for a while and then reading it in the past week. So here's how I'm going to structure my response. The first response will be about Difference in Repetition, and then I'll come back to Proust and Signs. So in Difference in Repetition, there is a section on Proust. It's actually less than one page where he talks about the eating of the Madeleine as being the instigation for the reminiscence of Cambrai. And that little vignette that we get, I think, actually suffices for a kind of miniature model of the entire book of difference and repetition. So, like Cooper was saying, there's a model of time at work here that's imported from Bergson, right? You can definitely see that functioning all throughout here. Let's just break it down quite simply. Let's say you're eating a Madeleine, all right, or let's make it something more familiar. I don't know, a hot dog or something, right? And it reminds you of Cub Stadium whenever you eat that hot dog. So if you eat the hot dog, there is a present moment in the past in which you've eaten that hot dog, right? When you eat it, you taste the flavor of the hot dog, the mustard, the softness of the bun, and the crowd screaming around you, right? It comprises a moment. But the reflection upon that in the form of a voluntary or involuntary memory has a similarity and a resemblance and even an identity that connects with that past moment, but there's also a kind of difference involved, right? And so now the question is, how do we connect the present as a present and the past as a former present? This is the big step that we're going to do. And so the tools that we get in difference and repetition allow us to do that. So what Deleuze says is that the taste of the Madeleine, or in our case, the taste of the hot dog from Cub Stadium, spans this double irreducibility. So the first is as a perception, right? We put the hot dog into our mouth, we hear the crowd, there it is. And then there's a second irreducibility in the form of involuntary memory. And as I said, between them, there's a resemblance and an identity, but they can't be defined as such. And so what the notion of difference is doing here is, how do we connect a past present with a present present? So what Deleuze says is that the taste of the hot dog in the perception of it and in the remembrance of it embodies a qualitative difference, which spans both of these irreducible moments. And so, here's the tricky part that I think that needs to be worked on if we're reading difference and repetition, is that the taste is that which envelops the memory of Cub Stadium as this tableau of the stadium in itself, as it is in itself, both in its past present and in the present present. And so the notion of Cub Stadium as in itself is not reducible to any identity in Deleuze's formulation. However, what he says is there's a difference at a depth which exists beyond the entirety of the series, from perception to the remembrance of it. And it produces both difference as a serial difference, like we're going from the past present to the present present, perception to memory, and identity, something that undergirds their continuity. Deleuze's inversion of the classical image of thought involves overturning the subordination of difference to identity, whereby now difference is this quality that stands behind the disjunct between difference in and identity in time, right? And so as we move up levels of depth from the worldly to the signs of love, through the sensuous, and then to the domain of essence in Proust and Signs, there's a kind of series of transcendences that embody these different levels of difference. So here's the model. You have difference, and then you have like two prongs coming out of that, which are difference and identity. And then from every difference, you have just more difference and identity. And it's difference all the way down, as I understand it. Now, I ran a little roughshod over the end there, but maybe Taylor can kind of either fill in the gaps or
no, that was fucking awesome. I think that was fucking great.
Yeah, I would want to piggyback off this by sticking to Proust and Signs.
Because, let's go back to that.
Because your example of the hot dog, or there's the as we know, the cookie, the Madeleine, that it gets us to the threshold of the work of art, of the highest level of science, which is essence, but it's not quite there, right? But it gets to the threshold. It gets to the level of the sensuous, right? And in that, it kind of prepares us. And prepares us for that apprenticeship for the work of art. Insofar as, I'm thinking in Guattari, he and Deleuze will always kind of juxtapose, even in like Proust and Signs, he'll juxtapose Kafka and Proust. These are like, for I think for both thinkers, like these two are, how does Guattari put it? He says that they are interested in the mutations of perceptive components. And I think this is really interesting. For Kafka, it's interoceptive, so it's posture, blood pressure, balance, and then Guattari gives the example that, let's remember how Kafka would drug himself on insomnia and anorexia. But with Proust, it's about these receptive faculties that we have. So perception, for Proust it's already this multiplicity where we have light receptors and taste receptors and touch receptors and heat receptors, pain receptors, sound receptors, etc. And it's that diversity that we can see in the cookie that it transversalizes. It produces, like, within perception itself, this movement from, because it embodies both taste and smell, as well as in there taking it to this limit. This is what propels the involuntary memory that is so intensive, right? Because one thing I would have said about your description of difference is, with the understanding of the differential, one of the key aspects too is intensity. That's really another way to talk about taking the faculties to their transcendent limit and forcing this violence is this intensive aspect. But I'll really quickly, and I'll give it back to you guys. On page 110 and 111, the anti-logos chapter, which is where he returns in this reflection on pitting Proust and Plato against one another, or you could even say Proust's atypical Platonism. He talks about how that Proust's literature is modern insofar as it sort of completely rethinks the problem of objectivity. So at the very top of, he talks about order has collapsed as much in the states of the world that were supposed to reproduce it as in the essences or ideas that were supposed to inspire it. And now I'm at the top of 111. The world has become crumbs and chaos, precisely because reminiscence proceeds from subjective associations to an originating viewpoint. Objectivity can no longer exist except in the work of art. It no longer exists in significant content as states of the world, nor in ideal signification as stable essence, but solely in the signifying formal structure of the work, in its style. And that's a very important word we'll have to come back to. It is no longer a matter of saying to create is to remember, but rather to remember is to create, is to reach that point where the associative chain breaks, leaps over the constituted individual, is transferred to the birth of an individuating world. And it's no longer a matter of saying to create is to think, but rather to think is to create, and primarily to create the act of thinking within thought. To think, then, is to provide food for thought. To remember is to create, not to create memory, but to create the spiritual equivalent of the still too material memory, to create the viewpoint valid for all associations, the style valid for all images. And it goes on. But I do think that question of style, too, is very important for Deleuze, especially, I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the refrain plateau, and where Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus come to understand how chaos, refrain, rhythm, the sort of the coded periodicity of rhythms in refrains kind of carve out territorialities, and how this can be understood in terms of style, and how then style, and in the broadest sense of the word, can be used to discuss local manifestations of the cosmos in their different milieus, right? These and this is precisely what I think Plateau is kind of figuring in. If we remember the definition they take from Bateson about the kind of self-vibrating region that sort of doesn't culminate, right? It's almost this kind of like tantric level of existence, so to speak, that's carved out from chaos. If that is approximates kind of what we are talking about as style, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. And everything you laid out with Diver's repetition about why the work of art, in its granting us access to essence, is, what does he say? It reconstitutes the beginning of the world, but also forms a specific world, right? So this,
Right. And he uses the word viewpoint, right,
Mhm.
with a capital V. Is it correct to say that we can understand that as being somewhat analogous to the notion of style?
I mean, I think it would be, it wouldn't be the same thing, but it would be inextricable from it, right? You'd have to discuss this question of viewpoints, but viewpoint isn't just on that fourth level of essence, right? We see it too in the dialectic, to use that word much loosely, not in the sense in which just the interplay is a better word, in the world of the lover and the beloved, right? That one of the reasons why Deleuze defines the signs of love in relation to jealousy is precisely that that fact that sort of the beloved is this possible world, and sort of there's something mysterious and that draws us in, but then at the same time we are merely one of the objects in that possible world because of their individuating viewpoint, and therefore that's what calls for that hunting down and chasing down of the signs of betrayal, or whatever he wants to call jealousy. He'll define jealousy very, very beautifully later in the book. Let me just say this, and then I'll kick it back to you guys. Jealousy is the very delirium of signs. That's what he says in 138. And I think that's a very interesting way to talk about the sort of the unknowable world and the possible world that is enveloped in the that's implicated in the beloved's viewpoint in relation to our own.
Yeah, I think the one of the interesting sort of analogies that I was able to draw from reading this text, when I think about what an apprenticeship is, it's a kind of calling to be called. And especially, I think of Carl Jung's notion of individuation. Once I had hit upon that, I tried to push that notion out as I read the text so that I could read it on its own terms, but it just kept coming back in. And so some of the themes surrounding Jung's work kind of came back in. And one of the stories that I thought of was Percival and the Fisher King. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this story, but the notion that the part of the tale of Percival where he finds himself in the castle of the Fisher King, but he does not know he's there. And so this is the sort of ultimacy, that he is to achieve later on in the story. At one point, very early on in the story, he has this brief brush with this experience of ultimacy, which I would make analogous to essence, or to pure joy in Deleuze's work here. And like you were saying, this notion of viewpoint, or this notion of a kind of a transcendence of the domain of signs, involves these conduits out of particular domains and an escalation or a transcendence upwards into other domains. So just to be clear, and so if you haven't read Proust and Signs and you're listening to this, what I'm referring to is this. There's 4 domains that Deleuze lays out. The first being is the worldly domain of signs, then the signs of love, the sensuous signs, as he says, and then the signs of pure joy. And the world of worldly signs is this kind of stupid world in which you have all of these, that's highly codified, in the sense that the signs of this world are almost emitted and reacted to in very deterministic kind of ways. That's the way that I read it in the text. But what's interesting is the worldliness involves a kind of constant inscription of the emissions of signs, to the point at which signs don't, as Deleuze says, refer to things, but stand in for referential content. So there's a kind of stupidity in the worldly domain, such that it's not so much about thought or action, as he says, but just anticipating thoughts and actions. But when we fall in love with somebody, it causes this rupture with this world of signs, right? And now, in our pursuit of the beloved, we, or maybe being jilted by the beloved, now we are instigated by this new force, which is jealousy, which is to understand the lover's lies, that which is not said. And then it sets us on this search that breaks us out of this sort of worldly domain, right? And so each one of these worlds, or these domains, as I've been calling them, involve this kind of break, right? Or an escalating upwards. I think even Deleuze uses that term at one point in the book. And so from the world of love, or from the signs of love, then come the signs of sensuousness. And this part, maybe I'll ask Taylor for a little bit of help here. As I understand it, as we fall in and out of love, right, there's a kind of repetition that takes place. It's almost as if we are reliving the lives of our love, or reliving certain repetitions, but with the difference of a new lover. And this series of loves forms its own chain. And then it has its own emission of signs associated with it. And I skipped over a big thing here, but maybe Taylor, you can take us back through it, because we should talk about the objective temptation and the subjective compensation that happens within love.
There was one thing before we jump to that, and now I can't find it, but he makes the point about, he's speaking about the narrator, and this has to do with that interplay between jealousy and love. As Deleuze says early on in the book, that jealousy is is sort of deeper than love, because it's the truth of love, right? It's the like subjective dimension of the truth of love. But he talks about the narrator falls in love with Albertine, and it's as I mentioned earlier, Albertine to the narrator is like Odette was to Swann. It's the potential for this neurotic black hole to kind of swallow him up, and to sort of take all of the resources of his creativity, of his desire, etc., and it threatens him with that failure to become artist, so to speak. And Deleuze talks about how, it's when the narrator is still in love with Albertine that he is, in a certain sense, kind of, I don't know if it's naivete, that's not what he says, but there's a certain, Proust kind of implies it, but there's also this, there is this resistance by the narrator to admit the truth of what Deleuze is saying about jealousy being the higher truth of love, insofar as the narrator, while he's in love with Albertine, is always proclaiming her innocence, as though it's the exact opposite of the truth of love, insofar as for Deleuze, and really it's he gets this from Proust, obviously, where it's the truth of love is and jealousy. But it's after that love is done with, and the narrator's moved on, and is not invested in that love, that he is able to flip the script and deem Albertine as guilty, as always kind of already being guilty. Now, this is where Deleuze goes into that really interesting stuff about Proustian transsexuality. I'll leave that aside because you asked me. We could get to that later, but I believe the question you were asking me about is very early on in the work. I think it's even in chapter 1. Am I correct? So on page 9, and this is what I was kind of quoting, where he says the first law of love is subjective. Subjectively, jealousy is deeper than love. It contains love's truth. And, for Deleuze, he'll even say that, it's all about this kind of quest, this hunt for signs, and this becoming sensitive to the signs of the beloved, right? To the signs emitted from this sort of mysterious possible world, this sort of inexhaustible and unknowable world. And that's precisely why jealousy constitutes this hunt of becoming sensitive to the point of sort of taking one's love to its limit, insofar as jealousy moves us to detect sort of in the signs emitted by the lover or by the beloved, that very betrayal that would prove the jealousy and the search itself to be grounded in a kind of reality. So that's why it's a kind of delirium, as he says. It's a delirium science. It is this, I believe Deleuze even uses I believe he makes the reference to Cassandra, right? And her, Cassandra famously, right, the oracle in ancient Greek myth, who who was the one who had the knowledge of the future without the ability to communicate those truths or to persuade others of the truth of her visions. We see this in like one of my favorite movies, 12 Monkeys, etc. But and there is an interplay of jealousy and betrayal and all of that too in that movie. But yeah, I'm not sure if I may have kind of taken your question on a little bit of a detour. Do you want to go on more about or riff off of? Does anybody want to riff off of what I've kind of just said?
I was almost thinking like in terms of like the gaps in the signs, or what define, like, I don't know, thinking like Lacan, this was kind of what was going through my head, is it's like the deception that's involved in uncovering the truth through jealousy, like those gaps of truth or whatever are sort of what define, whether it be like reflexively the love or the jealousy is more so. It's like those unspoken things, those things that can't be signified, the gaps that you're sort of having to fill in the sort of narrative of the other person, or the image of the other person that you're kind of constructing through the signs that they're emitting.
Yeah, and he says that it happens in two moments. The first is through the objective temptation. So when we fall in love, initially we believe the lover to be the holder of the secret of our intensity or passion, right? So we peg it on them, right? But then when we are cast aside, or we're feeling jilted or betrayed or what have you, the search then turns to the subjective compensation. And this is the lover asking themselves, hey, what went wrong? What did I do? Like trying to make sense of what seemed to be the failure in the search, right? And then when that sort of achieves its limit, because once again, we're talking about the limits of a sensibility, right? The limits of a faculty, right? And once there's a sort of point of exhaustion at which the apprentice is, I guess you would say, I'm going to use the word beckoned by the notion of an essence or a phantasm that contains within it both of these moments of the search, right? So all of these elements are sort of leading up to this sort of culminating realization in which all of the wasted time and regained time will be sort of folded back upon the apprentice, and all will be revealed, right? Because, and this is the way that Deleuze talks about it, it comes as a final revelation. And so what does this mean? This means seeing not only this one love's failure and its meanings, but then backing away from it, being on this path to, achieving the life of the aesthete, or the life of the artist, and then going through these series of lost or broken loves along the way. Not only are we making sense of these individual quote unquote failures, but the whole series of them and the sort of picture that it paints, for lack of a better word. Maybe better put, using the language of the text, how does the process of repetition within the text bear the secret and communicate a work that's being done that then gets realized when the search is complete?
What I find fascinating about the way Deleuze starts, he starts with the question of learning. And the word for, in French, the word for learning is apprendre, right? It's obviously related to apprenticeship. So when we don't necessarily think that in English, right? We don't hear that etymological echo, but in the conclusion to Difference Repetition, Deleuze will make clear that he will juxtapose this. Again, it's kind of like this classical image of thought wherein the highest goal is knowledge. And for Deleuze, that is empty and abstract and lifeless without the corresponding movement of learning that actually is is more fundamental and more appropriate to what he is finding here already. And he lays out on the very second page, where he says, one becomes a carpenter only by becoming sensitive to the signs of wood, a physician by becoming sensitive to the signs of ideas. And he'll point out these minor characters who, in other senses, are completely either illiterate or sort of numb to the various signs outside of their domain, but in their one domain, either in diplomacy or in disease, whatever, they have a hyper attuned sensitivity to those signs, and therefore can excel in their own way there. I think for Proust, it's precisely the artist who has to sort of continually ascend and descend those four levels that you laid out of the worldly and love, sensuosity, and art, the work of art, or pure joy or essence, right? And it's that ascending and descending movement that's caused by the sort of the violence of these signs to think, and the sensitivity. We have to have the required sensitivity, almost like becoming equal to the event of already being sort of becoming predisposed to receive those signs. And I think that's why for Guattari, his whole reading of the narrator's journey in the search is in a first time. He is not predisposed. He is not sensitive to the sort of machinic possibilities of Van Tuyel's little phrase. And it's through that intense love and loss of Albertine and coming out the other side that he, in a second time, becomes equal to that event and then is able to allow it to force him to think and thereby to create.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Dan Smith has a great take on this because I think one of the takeaways from this discussion or the reading of the book is that Deleuze is using this word sign, and I think I mentioned this before, but it's definitely worth stating again, is that this word sign doesn't correspond to maybe what we conventionally understand as a sign.
That's a good point.
And that's happening with almost every word here. Essence. Right. I think anytime you encounter a Deleuze text, a good methodology is just make it, take inventory of all the conceptual terminology being used. And then, after you've read a couple of pages, just check in with yourself. Like, where are you at? Are you getting those terms? Right. And Dan Smith lays it out really nicely. He says that a sign is not a recognizable object, right? We have this sort of anti-representational thing going on here with his notion of signs, but it's a particular quality of an object, and it defines a limit of sensibility, which is kind of a phrase that you've been using all along here, Taylor, right? And so each faculty has its own limit. And there's another word too, faculty. I mean, who in the history of philosophy in the 1960s is using a concept of faculties, right? Especially with the emergence of cognitive science.
Yeah, like who are the neo-Kantians up in here that are...
Right. But I think in terms of developing a line of thought, the notion of faculty does a lot of interesting and creative work. And in this text, it constitutes this notion of a limit, which is definitive of its own capacity. How far, for example, can one's perception go, right? Or like, what is the perceptual limit of our ability to see or hear or feel, or in a certain way? And what Deleuze thinks is that when we approach, either immediately or asymptotically this limit, it gives rise to the possibility of thought, because there is no such thing in this philosophy as a sort of a priori preordained knowledge. the work of philosophy is the creation of concepts. It is the creation of new lines of thinking. And the way that that is done is by approaching these limits, that our encounters with these limits through the force of violence give rise to the possibility of thought. And what is their purpose, or what is their telos in Proust and Signs? Well, it's one that carries us along to the possibility of a pure joy, which for me, appears as a kind of Nietzschean affirmation, right? There's almost like a birth of tragedy thing going on here, where we're making this exit from the worldly, right, into romantic love, and then into the sensuous world of both pain, of a kind of confused pain and joy, that then gives way to the possibility of experiencing a pure joy, an unadulterated affirmation.
I think that's absolutely right, because if you look at the end of Difference and Repetition, Deleuze sort of explicitly states that one can be left in sort of the Dionysian, right? I think the term was like drunkenly stumbling the subject is eventually found themselves. So I think that's absolutely correct.
Coop, do you have anything to respond with, or was there anything that you had in mind?
No, not here.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to like put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure you had space to chat. We're all very sort of electrified by the text, and it's easy to get we've become sensitive to Deleuze's signs here. What you said about Dan Smith's explication of, not to pun, of signs. I think Guattari and Coop and I have spent a lot of time, working through that first grueling part of the Machinic Unconscious, and where Guattari, from the very first, the introductory chapter, makes clear that he will start using, he'll define semiology and semiotics and distinguish them by saying, semiology is limited to the domain of linguistic signs of language, or even just signifiers if on a certain level. And for him, semiotics would be obviously working with asignifying agrammatical signs, to the point where he'll even, and they'll I'm not sure if they first coined it in Andy Edibus or A Thousand Plateaus, but they have the idea of science particles, and this sort of monstrous wedding of the material and the virtual, and in a kind of, in a Schrödingerian way, just in a relativity way, there's no way to distinguish them. To distinguish them is to sort of forget their complementarity. So it's this role of science particles for Guattari. I think that is a catchphrase to describe the affective force, affective and effective force of something like Ventouil's little phrase, and how he can see Ventouil's little phrase in its refrain aspect as a component of passage, literally for the narrator.
Maybe we'll kind of finish up. Maybe our last thing will be to talk about the body without organs, which is really only a page and a half, the very last thing that Deleuze talks about. And whenever I think about the body without organs, I think about the notion that Deleuze and Guattari at one point were not in agreement on what the concept actually was, if their definition of it was in fact the same. Deleuze's notion of the body without organs and the image of the spider that he presents at the end kind of encapsulates everything that happens in the book. And it also prefigures a lot of what we'll encounter in a text like A Thousand Plateaus. I'm thinking the text Geology of Morals in particular, where he talks about the milieu and intensity. And so we kind of have a sort of proto-concept of milieu and intensity functioning in this image. I pose the question as this: what is the body without organs of the search for truth, of the search for lost time? And my explication of it is akin to a spider in her web. The web, the spider, and the entire milieu of the web and the spider, and perhaps the awning to which it's connected, exists and comprises an array of intensities in communication with one another. And so the way that Deleuze develops the image is that the spider doesn't have eyes, ears, and so forth, but it has a sensitivity to the web. So when something hits the web, there's a pulse or a vibration that hits the spider, right? And it responds accordingly. And it would be a mistake in Deleuze's ontology to think that the web and the spider exist independent of one another, right? They are this sort of enmeshed intensity. And the series of the spider, the fly, and the web, they all comprise this series of communicating elements. The one thing that Deleuze says here that really interests me that I don't see in other places where the body without organs concept is developed, he says that organs awaken along the search. So I really like that. And I wish that would have been developed in other places. Maybe he does. I could be totally wrong. I don't remember it. But the idea that when we hit the limit of our sensibility, when a faculty or a sign sort of achieves this sort of like critical moment, there's an involuntary awakening of an organ. Maybe it's an organ of perception. So what's required is an incessant disturbance or violence from the outside. That's the way that this happens. And these forces compel us. And here's my take on it. Like, how can we understand what Deleuze is up to? And I have to go back to Freud and Jung here, because the way that the search for signs compels the apprentice is very similar to the way that an analysand is compelled to the therapeutic environment by a harrowing dream, right? It gets us searching for meanings outside of their worldly domain. So what happens in a dream? You have elements, you have these sort of non-totalizable elements in communication with one another, lifted up and out of their most familiar context, a worldly context, right? And they're interacting in a way that sensitizes us and does a kind of violence to us. And the same kind of rapture occurs with the experience of a profound dream or fantasy that happens at these different levels, this break from the worldly, this break from the signs of love, and then the movement into the sensual world, and then the movement into the world of pure joy. And of course, there's a circulation, right? This isn't a linear movement, right? We're going back and forth all of the time. But I think the metaphor of dream analysis is really fruitful because it's precisely the space of dream analysis with the analyst, or whether you're doing it on your own through active imagination. And I'm saying this because a lot of our listeners want us to do an episode on Carl Jung. I keep getting messages about this. This could be a really good starting point to talk about that, because what happens in Jungian dream analysis that we don't see in Freudian dream analysis is this notion of the archetypes. And this is something that Deleuze riffs on in other essays, and which we'll talk about at a later time. But what the archetypes afford us that Freud's conception of Oedipus does not is that it allows us to engage in a kind of transversal play with signs. And this play instigates resonances and expands our ability to move transversely through signs, right? It's not only the running up against the limit, but the creation of the possibility of new ways of thinking about it, such that it can expand the limits of thinking itself.
Yeah, I love all of that. I had, there's a bunch of points in the text I could point to. One of them was on page 101. He talks about Socrates' irony versus Proust's humor, right? He'll call it his Jewish humor. And that already prefigures important series in the Logic of Sense, which he'll write 5 years later. But he says Proust's humor is different than Socrates' irony. One must be endowed for the signs, ready to encounter them. One must be open to their violence. And I really love what you said about along the search, like you said, organs are found or they develop.
Awakened.
They awaken.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yes.
That's great. Go on. You can fill in.
Oh, no. I think a great way to get interested in this book, and this is just me projecting onto all of our listeners, is to just read the last 2 pages and then start the book.
Oh, right? Yeah, sure. So yeah, I guess to get back to it, that question that one must be endowed. That's almost in English that has a very sexual understanding. I think really we have to be equipped, right? We have to be able to compose our forces in a Spinozistic sense, right? And assemble in different assemblages, and we're not always already pre-equipped. This is precisely apprenticeship and becoming sensitive, and this is why organs awaken. And so to get to your question about body without organs, it's obviously not, and of course Artaud means it in his own way, from whom we get the phrase. And as you said, Deleuze and Guattari may have, even if they may or may not have disagreed strongly, you can see a very you can see a shift in the way body without organs is used in Anti-Oedipus to 1,000 Plateaus, and there could be books written on whether or not those meanings can be reconciled. But the point being that it's not against the organs, right? It's against the organization of the organism. And so here we could talk about this is precisely another Kantian way of thinking about the faculties that you just brought up too, which is why Deleuze finds their working and their violence and their effectivity and their taking to the limit in their disaccord and their disharmony. And it's precisely the over-organization or the overcoding of an organization of the faculties that causes us, for example, causes these 1,000 years old problems because of its slumber, and it needs to be awakened, right? It's precisely its predominance, or at least presupposed dominance, that causes a kind of overly stratified organization that precludes these different assemblages and these different multiplicities in which we or bodies can participate. So it kind of stifles the power of their virtual power to that extent. Now, with ending the book with this question of the spider as a body without organs, which is, the narrator is less, he says it's more of a spider, right? And he even says earlier, though, that the narrator, it's less appropriate in the search to talk about a narrator than to talk about a kind of literary machine, a kind of productive machine that is assembling in these various configurations and is sort of working with this kind of intense movement of variation, etc., that we see that we can see the development of the artist, which is truly, as I tried to say, that's at least one of the main threads of the whole novel, is to lead to where the narrator, we could say as machine, right? It becomes this, is able to compose his forces with an art machine.
Yeah, I guess like one thing I could end with, and maybe this is like too pedantic, or like maybe I'll be guilty of like hypertextualism or whatever, like, but hey, like in the spirit of Amy Coney Barrett, I'll say I'm a fucking Deleuzean originalist, whatever. Jesus. On page 181, Deleuze notes that the narrator never has the organs that he needs, or at least not the ones that he would like to have. He cites the kiss of Albertine, in which he says that there is no adequate organ to sort of engage in this sort of activity, but then goes on to talk about the spider who is forming sort of a multiplicity, right? The full body without organs is a series of multiplicities, right? So we understand that in Craig's description of the spider, right? But I can't help but be drawn to make a comparison, because I know that there is sort of a belief among Deleuzean scholars, of which I am not one, where there's a differentiation between this explanation of the body without organs and that is present in his work with Guattari. But I can't help but see that there is a sort of a relationship between the way in which it's presented here and, say, lice hopping on the beach, or skin colonies, or the fact that the full body without organs is populated by multiplicities. I do wonder if maybe what you can take away, and why I really like the just read the last 2 pages, is this is the flagrant proof that, in fact, Deleuze does engage in some of his most rigorous philosophical work when he is faced with a literary canon or with film. which I guess is him preeminently cashing the check that he writes himself with Guattari in What is Philosophy, right? When he describes uh, the indirect function that filmmakers, artists, and novelists play in the philosopher's creation of concepts. So, in a sense, this sort of is like living, breathing literary proof of that.